What happens when a young black musician, worn down by a world that refuses to see his talent, is forced to make a choice that could change everything? James Wilson left his tough neighborhood with nothing but a dream and a guitar, hoping his music would be the key to a better life. Instead, he finds those doors shut tight by prejudice, pushing him to the cold streets, where only his songs keep him alive. But one night, fate takes an unexpected turn, bringing him face to face with the very man who shattered his hopes, a wealthy, influential producer who suddenly finds himself in need of saving. In a moment that could have been about revenge, James chooses a different path. What unfolds next is a journey neither man could have foreseen. As they navigate an unlikely partnership, both must confront their own prejudices, challenge a flawed system, and find a way to transform their voices into a force for change. If you're looking for a story filled with emotion, hope, and the power to move you from beginning to end, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for this unforgettable journey of redemption and the courage to rise above. James Wilson's story began in the cramped, noisy streets of Rivertown, a small, overlooked neighborhood on the fringes of a sprawling city. Rivertown was a place that seemed forgotten by progress, a patchwork of dilapidated buildings, narrow alleyways, and cracked sidewalks. But even in this forgotten corner of the world, there was a kind of beauty. The way children played in the streets with makeshift toys, the way neighbors looked out for one another, and the way music flowed like a river through the veins of the community. James's family lived in a small, worn-down apartment in a building that creaked and groaned with age. His mother, Gloria, was a nurse at the local hospital, her days filled with long, exhausting shifts, but she always managed to come home with a smile for her children. His father, Samuel, was a mechanic whose hands were always dirty with engine oil, but whose soul was clean and pure. Samuel loved music, especially jazz and blues. When he wasn't working, he'd sit on the porch with his battered old guitar, playing soft, mournful tunes that drifted down the street like a breeze on a hot day. It was from Samuel that James first learned to love music. As a little boy, he would sit at his father's feet, mesmerized by the way his fingers moved over the guitar strings. At 5 years old, he picked up that same guitar, struggling to make a sound, but feeling an electric thrill every time he managed to pluck a note. Samuel noticed his son's fascination and began to teach him the basics. James was a quick learner. Within a few months, he could play simple songs, and by the time he was 8, he was already improvising his own tunes. For James, music was more than just a hobby. It was a lifeline. It was a way to escape the harsh realities of Rivertown. His lyrics spoke of love, loss, hope, and the struggles of life. His voice, even as a child, had a raw, soulful quality that seemed to carry the weight of his world. When he sang, people listened. He became a local sensation, performing at school events, church gatherings, and community celebrations. His performances were filled with passion, his voice carrying the stories of his neighborhood to anyone who would listen. But Rivertown was a hard place, especially for a young black boy with dreams of something bigger. The streets were filled with temptations and dangers, gangs that promised fast money, drugs that offered a temporary escape, and the ever-present threat of violence. James saw friends get caught up in that darkness, drawn in by the allure of easy choices. His parents, however, kept him grounded. "Stay close to your music, son," Samuel would say. "It's your way out of here." James took those words to heart. He practiced relentlessly, pouring his soul into his music. His guitar became an extension of himself, a vessel through which he could express all the emotions that welled up inside him. Every note was a shout of defiance, a declaration that he would not be swallowed by the streets. At 18, James made the hardest decision of his life. With his family's blessing, he left Rivertown, setting out for the big city with nothing but his father's old guitar, a few notebooks filled with lyrics, and a small amount of cash his mother had saved from her long shifts. The city was intimidating and alive in ways that Rivertown could never be. The skyline was dotted with towering skyscrapers, each one seeming to reach out and touch the sky. The streets were a cacophony of sounds, car horns, distant sirens, and the endless hum of people moving with purpose. It was here, James believed, that he would make his mark. He began playing at open mics and small venues, trying to find his footing in the city's sprawling music scene. His performances were magnetic. When James sang, it was as if the world paused to listen. His voice was deep, resonant, and filled with a kind of raw emotion that was impossible to ignore. The audiences were small, but they were captivated. He quickly became a favorite at several local spots, his name whispered among those who appreciated real, unfiltered talent. Yet, the city was not as welcoming as it seemed. Every audition, every meeting with a record label ended the same way, with a polite but hollow smile and the words, "You've got potential, but it's not what we're looking for." At first, he didn't understand. How could they not see his talent? How could they not feel the depth of his music? He started to notice patterns. The other artists who were chosen looked nothing like him. They had a certain image, a marketable image, as the industry insiders would say. They were polished, often white, with a sound that fit neatly into a box the industry had already built. James, with his raw, unfiltered blues and soul, did not fit that mold. One day, after months of dead ends and closed doors, James received a call that seemed like a beacon of hope. It was an invitation to audition for a major music label, one known for turning unknown talents into stars. The audition would be held in front of Thomas Blake, a legendary producer famous for his ruthless critiques and keen eye for marketable talent. James prepared for days, choosing his best song, one that spoke to the heart of his experiences, his struggles, and his hopes. It was a song about his father, about growing up in Rivertown, about the pain and the beauty of it all. He poured everything he had into it, knowing this was his chance to make them see him. The day of the audition, James arrived at the studio early. The waiting room was filled with other hopefuls, most of them young, white, and dressed in designer clothes. They carried expensive guitars and talked loudly about their brand and image. James felt out of place in his worn jeans and second-hand jacket, but he tried to keep his focus. When his name was called, he walked into the audition room with his head held high. The room was cold and sterile, with bright lights shining down from above. Thomas Blake sat at a long table, surrounded by a panel of judges. He was a tall man, with a sharp jawline and piercing eyes that seemed to look straight through you. As James stepped up to the microphone, he could feel the weight of their scrutiny. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and began to play. The room was silent as he sang. His voice, rich and full of emotion, seemed to fill every corner of the room. His fingers moved over the guitar strings with grace and precision, each note a testament to years of practice and passion. When he finished, the silence was deafening. For a brief moment, he thought he had done it, that he had broken through. But then, Thomas Blake leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he said, "You've got a good voice, kid, but it's not what our audience is looking for. We're trying to appeal to a broader crowd." James felt a knot form in his stomach. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice steady but strained. Blake smirked. "Look, it's just business. People want what they're familiar with. You're talented, but you're not what's selling right now. The words hit James like a punch to the gut. Are you saying it's because I'm black? Blake didn't hesitate. I'm saying it's because the market has certain expectations. It's not personal. It's just the way it is. James left the studio that day with his heart in pieces. It wasn't just another rejection. It was a stark reminder of the barriers that existed not because of his lack of talent, but because of the color of his skin. After that day, things went downhill quickly. James continued to audition, continued to put himself out there, but it was like hitting the same wall over and over again. His savings dried up. The small, dingy apartment he had been renting was no longer affordable. One day, he found himself standing on the street with nothing but his father's guitar and a backpack full of clothes. Living on the streets was a different kind of reality. The city that had once seemed so full of promise now felt like a vast, unforgiving wasteland. Nights were cold, and hunger gnawed at his insides. Shelters were often full, and the few beds that were available went to those who were quick or lucky. James spent his nights sleeping in doorways, under bridges, and on park benches. His guitar, once a source of joy, was now his lifeline. During the day, he played on street corners and in subway stations, hoping to earn enough change to buy a meal. His voice was still as powerful as ever, but the people rushing by rarely stopped to listen. When they did, their faces were often filled with pity, or worse, fear. To many, he was just another black man on the street, another potential threat. But James kept playing. He played because it was the only thing that kept him sane. He played because it reminded him of who he was and who he could be. James quickly learned that there was a hierarchy even in the realm of homelessness, a hierarchy influenced by race. He watched as white street performers were given the benefit of the doubt, while black performers, like himself, were met with suspicion. He saw how people reacted to him versus a white homeless man asking for change. The white man might get a sympathetic smile or a few dollars, while James would get averted gazes or muttered comments. The racism wasn't always overt. It was often quiet, insidious. People would tell him he was so talented for a street performer, or suggest he stick to more traditional black music, like blues or gospel. One woman, after listening to him play a soulful ballad, smiled and said, "You have such a unique style. Have you thought about playing something more mainstream?" James wanted to scream at her, to tell her that his music was already as mainstream as it got, that it spoke to universal themes of pain, love, and hope. But he held his tongue. He had learned that fighting every small battle would wear him down even faster. One particularly cold afternoon, a young white man with a camera around his neck stopped to listen. After James finished his song, the man said, "You should try to stick to jazz or blues. I think it would really suit you." James looked at him, his face expressionless. "I play what I feel," he replied. "And right now, this is what I feel." The man nodded, looking a bit embarrassed, and hurried away. James sighed and continued playing, the weight of the city pressing down on him. One frigid winter evening, as snow began to fall gently from the sky, James was playing his guitar on a busy street corner. The wind cut through his thin jacket like a knife, but he kept playing, his breath visible in the cold night air. His fingers, numb and stiff, moved over the strings, each note a struggle against the biting cold. The city around him bustled with activity, people rushing to get home, cars honking in frustration, the distant wail of a siren. Across the street, James noticed a well-dressed man stumble and fall onto the sidewalk. At first, he thought it was just another drunk who'd had too much to drink. But as he looked closer, he realized something was different. The man's clothes were too clean, his shoes too polished. This wasn't a homeless man. James watched as people hurried past the fallen man, their heads down, not wanting to get involved. A part of him felt the familiar pang of bitterness. He could just turn away, let the man lie there. It wasn't his problem, but something inside him wouldn't let him do that. Setting his guitar down gently, he crossed the street and knelt beside the man. As he got closer, his breath caught in his throat. It was Thomas Blake, the same Thomas Blake who had dismissed him with those cold, condescending words. The same Thomas Blake who had helped close every door in the music industry to him. James felt a rush of anger and resentment. He could walk away. He should walk away. Let the city take him, as it had taken so many others. But then he looked at Blake's face, pale, contorted in pain. He was clearly having a heart attack. James could see the life slipping away from him with every passing second. He couldn't do it. He couldn't let someone die, even someone like Thomas Blake. Damn it, James muttered to himself as he checked for a pulse. It was weak and erratic. "Stay with me," he whispered, his hands moving to begin chest compressions. "Come on, don't you dare die on me." For what felt like an eternity, James continued CPR, his breath coming in short, labored bursts as he counted the compressions aloud. 1, 2, 3. His voice trembled with a mixture of urgency and fear. Around him, people still passed by, but finally, a woman stopped and called 911. Minutes later, the ambulance arrived. Paramedics rushed to take over, and within moments, Thomas was on a stretcher, an oxygen mask over his face. As the ambulance doors closed, James stood there, his body trembling from the cold and the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had just saved the life of a man who had treated him as if he were nothing. The irony of it all was almost too much to bear. James continued his life on the streets, but the act of saving Thomas Blake had stirred something deep within him. It was a mixture of anger, confusion, and a strange sense of hope that he couldn't quite put into words. The reality of homelessness didn't change. He still faced the bitter cold of the nights, the hunger that gnawed at his insides, and the daily struggle to find shelter and safety. But now, he had something else to think about. Every day, James saw the world around him through a new lens. He watched how people treated him differently because of his skin color, how shop owners would turn him away with excuses, or call the police if he lingered too long outside their establishments. He saw the distrust in their eyes, the way they looked at him as if he were always on the verge of committing some crime. But James was not alone. He became part of an unofficial community of street performers and the homeless who looked out for each other. There was Maria, an older woman who used to be a school teacher before her life fell apart. She often brought him scraps of food or a cup of hot coffee when she could spare it. And Leroy, an elderly bluesman who had lived on the streets for years, taught James a few tricks on the guitar that he had picked up over a lifetime. "Play with your heart, kid," Leroy would say. "That's all that matters in the end." James formed bonds with these people, other street performers, homeless folks, and outcasts. They looked out for one another, sharing what little they had. For all the brutality of the streets, there was still a sense of community among those who had been cast aside. But even among the homeless, James could feel the sting of racism. It was in the way a white homeless man might be offered spare change more often than a black one. It was in the way some of the other street performers viewed him, either as competition or as a threat. Yet James refused to let the bitterness consume him. He played his music for himself and for those who would listen, finding solace in the notes that flowed from his guitar. While James navigated the daily challenges of homelessness, he also became acutely aware of the subtle, pervasive racism that colored every interaction he had. He watched how other homeless people were treated, how a white man in ragged clothes might still receive a sympathetic look or a few dollars, while James, a black man, was often met with suspicion or fear. It wasn't just the overt racism that wore him down, but the quieter, more insidious kind. There were the looks, the way people's eyes would narrow when they saw him, the way they would grip their bags a little tighter or cross the street to avoid him. And then there were the comments. One afternoon, after playing a set that had drawn a small crowd, a middle-aged white woman approached him with a smile. "You're very talented," she said, "but have you thought about playing something a bit more fitting, like jazz or gospel?" James forced a polite smile, but inside, he felt a familiar anger rising. "I play what I feel," he replied evenly, "and right now, this is what I feel." The woman's smile faltered, and she quickly walked away, muttering something under her breath. James sighed and continued playing, the bitter taste of the encounter lingering like a bad aftertaste. It wasn't that people meant to be cruel. It was just that they couldn't see beyond their own narrow perspectives. They couldn't see him. One day, a young white man with a camera stopped to listen. After James finished his song, the man said, "You've got a lot of talent. You should really try to get into blues. It's in your blood, you know?" James stared at him, the exhaustion and frustration evident in his eyes. "What do you know about my blood?" he replied, his voice tinged with weariness. The man looked taken aback and mumbled an apology before hurrying away. James watched him go, a mixture of anger and sadness churning inside him. He didn't want to be angry. He didn't want to feel this way. But every day, he was reminded of the barriers that stood between him and his dreams. Barriers that had nothing to do with his talent and everything to do with the color of his skin. After that cold winter night, when he had saved Thomas Blake's life, James found himself thinking a lot about his past and his future. He thought about Rivertown, his family, his father's old guitar, and the lessons he had learned as a child. He thought about the people he had met on the streets, the kindness and cruelty he had seen, and the quiet racism that seemed to be woven into the fabric of society. He also thought about Thomas Blake. Why had he saved him? Why hadn't he just walked away? Wouldn't it have been poetic justice to let him die there, alone and forgotten? But no matter how many times he turned the question over in his mind, the answer was always the same. He couldn't let someone die, not even someone like Blake. James's reflections led him to a new kind of resolve. He was tired of being invisible, tired of being treated like he was less than. He wanted to be seen, to be heard. He wanted to make people listen, not just to his music, but to his story. He didn't know how he would do it, but he knew he had to try. With this newfound determination, James began to change his approach. He still played on street corners, but now he started to tell stories between songs. Stories about his life, about the people he had met, about the injustices he had seen. He spoke with a raw honesty that resonated with those who stopped to listen. His music became a form of protest, a way to speak out against the world that had tried to silence him. Slowly, his audience grew. People began to take notice, not just of his talent, but of his message. Some days he would draw a decent crowd, and more importantly, he began to see a change in how people responded to him. They weren't just listening, they were hearing him. One cold, gray afternoon, as James was setting up on his usual street corner, he noticed a man standing across the street, watching him. The man was tall, wearing a long coat and a hat pulled low over his face. At first, James thought he was just another passerby, but the man didn't move. He just stood there, his eyes fixed on James. As James began to play, the man slowly crossed the street and approached him. When he got closer, James recognized him. It was Thomas Blake. For a moment, James's fingers froze on the strings. He hadn't seen Blake since that night, and he had never expected to see him again. What was he doing here? Was this some kind of joke? Blake stood there, his face unreadable. "Can we talk?" he said, his voice quieter than James remembered. James didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure he wanted to talk to Blake, but something in the man's eyes, something vulnerable, almost pleading, made him nod. They moved to a nearby bench, away from the crowd. Blake sat down heavily, as if the weight of the world were on his shoulders. "I owe you my life," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "I know you probably hate me, and I don't blame you. I've done things, said things I'm not proud of, but I want to make things right." James stared at him, his expression guarded. "Why now? Why do you care all of a sudden?" Blake sighed deeply, his eyes searching James's. "Because I've had a lot of time to think. Lying in that hospital bed, I realized how close I came to losing everything. And I realized that I've spent my life building walls instead of bridges." James didn't say anything. He didn't know if he could believe Blake, if this was just another performance, or if he was being sincere. But there was a part of him, a small, fragile part, that wanted to believe. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Blake continued. "I'm asking for a chance to make amends. I've heard your music. You've got something real, something people need to hear. And I want to help you do that." James looked at him, his face still hard, but his eyes softening just a little. "And what's in it for you?" Blake smiled, a sad, self-deprecating smile. "Maybe a little redemption. Maybe I want to prove to myself that I can be better. I don't know, but I want to try." James considered his words carefully. He had every reason to walk away, to tell Blake to go to hell, but something in his gut told him to give this a chance. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe it was naive. But maybe, just maybe, it was what he needed to do. "All right," he said finally. "I'll give you a chance. But if you screw me over, I swear." Blake held up his hands. "I won't. I promise." And so, against all odds, they began to work together. It wasn't easy. There were moments of tension, of mistrust, of old wounds reopening, but there were also moments of understanding, of unexpected kindness, of bridges being built where there had once been walls. Their partnership began cautiously. Blake arranged for James to perform at small, underground clubs, places where raw talent was valued over polished performances. These venues were different from the sleek commercial spaces James had auditioned for before. They were filled with people who wanted to hear something real, something that spoke to their hearts. James's music resonated with them. His songs were raw, his voice full of emotion, and his lyrics spoke to the experiences of struggle, survival, and hope. As the weeks went by, Blake and James spent more time together. They would meet after each performance, sitting in the dimly lit corners of bars, discussing music, life, and the industry. Slowly, they began to understand each other better. Blake opened up about his past, his upbringing, and how he had fallen into the mindset of the industry. He admitted that he had let his prejudices guide him, and he was trying to unlearn what he had known. James listened, skeptical but willing to hear Blake out. He could see that Blake was struggling to reconcile his past with the man he wanted to be now. It wasn't easy for James to let go of his anger, but he started to see glimpses of a man who was genuinely trying to change. One night, after a particularly successful show, Blake handed James a contract. "I want to produce your album," he said. "No strings attached. Just you, your music, and your story." James took the contract, his hands trembling slightly. This was what he had always wanted, but he couldn't help but feel a surge of anxiety. "I don't want to be anyone's charity case," he said quietly. Blake shook his head. "This isn't charity, James. This is me recognizing that I was wrong, and you deserve this." James studied Blake's face for a long moment before nodding. "All right," he said. "Let's do this." The process of recording the album was both exhilarating and grueling. Blake brought in some of the best session musicians and sound engineers, but he made sure to let James have full creative control. It was a stark contrast to the industry norms, where producers often dictated every aspect of an artist's work. For the first time, James felt like his voice was being heard. He poured everything he had into the album. The songs were a reflection of his life, his childhood in Rivertown, his struggles in the big city, his experiences on the streets, and his desire for change. There were songs of pain and loss, but also songs of hope and resilience. Each track was a piece of his soul, and the recording sessions were intense, filled with moments of raw emotion. Blake was there, every step of the way, offering guidance without overstepping. He encouraged James to dig deeper, to push himself to explore new sounds and styles. They worked late into the night, often arguing, but always finding common ground. As the album began to take shape, word spread. People started to take notice. Journalists, music critics, and fans alike. There was a buzz building, a sense that something special was happening. When the album was finally released, it was met with critical acclaim. The raw honesty and emotional depth of James's music resonated with people. His story, of a young black man who had been overlooked, discarded, and yet had found a way to rise, struck a chord in a world hungry for authenticity. Blake and James held a small launch event in one of the clubs where James had first played. It wasn't a glamorous affair, but it was real. The crowd was filled with people from all walks of life. Fans, journalists, other musicians, and even some of the people James had met on the streets. Maria and Leroy were there, beaming with pride. The energy in the room was electric. James took the stage, his guitar slung over his shoulder. For a moment, he stood there, looking out at the crowd. Then he smiled and began to play. The first notes of his opening song filled the room, and the crowd fell silent. His voice was strong and clear, each word carrying the weight of his journey. He played for over an hour, pouring his heart into each song. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was a roar of appreciation, of recognition, of understanding. Blake watched from the side, a smile tugging at his lips. He had seen many artists perform over the years, but there was something different about this moment. It wasn't just about the music. It was about what the music represented, a bridge that had been built between two very different worlds. The success of the album marked a new chapter in James's life. He was no longer the homeless musician playing on street corners. He was a rising star with a voice that demanded to be heard. But more than that, he had become a symbol of resilience, of hope, and of the power of forgiveness. Blake, too, found himself on a new path. He had spent years building walls, but now he was learning how to tear them down. His reputation in the industry began to change. Some criticized him for his newfound wokeness, while others praised him for his courage to admit his mistakes and do better. Together, James and Blake began to speak out about the issues that had shaped their journey, about the need for diversity in the music industry, about the power of second chances, and about the importance of building bridges instead of walls. They participated in panels, gave interviews, and even organized a series of benefit concerts to support homeless communities and underrepresented artists. Their partnership was not without its challenges. There were still moments of tension, of old wounds resurfacing, but they had come to understand that change was not a destination. It was a journey they were committed to taking together. The story of James and Blake began to spread beyond the music world. It became a story of hope and transformation that resonated with people everywhere. James received invitations to perform at major music festivals and speak at universities. His songs were played on the radio, his lyrics quoted by activists and politicians alike. But through it all, James remained grounded. He never forgot where he came from, never forgot the people who had helped him along the way. He continued to visit Rivertown, to play for the community that had raised him, to show the kids growing up there that there was another way. Blake, too, continued to evolve. He used his platform to advocate for systemic changes in the industry, to support young artists from marginalized communities, and to challenge the status quo. He knew he could never fully erase his past mistakes, but he could work every day to make amends. Their journey was far from over, but they had taken the first steps. Together, they had turned a moment of crisis into an opportunity for growth. And in doing so, they had shown the world that it was never too late to change.